Hello everyone, my name is Gavin'AGoodTime 42 and I am here today to bring you a new little treat. Um, I play Magic the Gathering quite often, and my last stream was actually a unboxing of the new Magic set with two companions of mine that I play Magic with. However, this time we're going to be doing something a bit different, and we are going to actually be building a deck today for you just out of cards that I have with me. So today the deck we are going to be building is Kozilek, the Great Distortion. He is one of the new Eldrazi from the Return to Zendikar set, and he's a big ol' Eldrazi, big and mean, but he's kind of unique in the sense that he's one of the few creatures that actually has the colorless symbol in his converted mana cost. So what Kozilek the Great Distortion is he is a 10-drop. He costs 8 and 2 colorless. He is a 12/12 that states when you cast Kozilek, if you have fewer than 7 cards in your hand, draw cards equal to the difference. So he's automatically going to be refilling your hand every time you cast him, which is really, really nice. He has Menace, which means he has to be blocked by at least 2 creatures. And he has the unique ability of discard a card with converted mana cost X. Counter target spell with converted mana cost X. So basically what that means for everyone is if an opponent is casting a spell that is 5 mana, I can discard a 5-drop from my hand to just immediately counter it. So that's a really powerful effect. Very few cards have anything like that. And it's on a giant creature that also has Menace and has to be blocked by 2 creatures. So that is immediately a huge threat that has to be dealt with. But it's going to be tough to deal with it when you can counter spells off of him alone. So what we're going to be starting with today is we're going to be starting with the land base. And the first 3 cards we have here are the 3 Urza lands. Now, each of them just taps for a colorless mana. If you have all 3 on the field, though, they tap for a total of 7 mana. The tower taps for 3, the mine taps for 2, and the power plant taps for 2. So that's a pretty powerful effect. The Eye of Ugin is our next basic land. It makes Eldrazi's cost 2 less to cast any Eldrazi spells. So that includes stuff like All is Dust, which counts as an Eldrazi spell. And then you can pay 7 and tap it to search for a colorless creature and put it into your hand, and then you shuffle. Pretty good effect. Then we have Ghost Quarter and Tectonic Edge for some of your basic land destruction needs, because there's always going to be a few land out there that are just really annoying to deal with, like your Urborg or your Cabal Coffers, and it's just going to be a pain to deal with them otherwise. So those lands are there for that reason. Then we have Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, and this taps for colorless, but if you have 7 or more lands, you can activate its other ability to add 2 colorless to your mana pool, but you can only spend it to cast colorless spells. Considering Kozilek is a completely colorless deck, that's not a downside. So eventually, that'll just be really helpful, but you can't activate abilities with it, so that's pretty limiting. Next up, we have Ruins of Oran Reef, and it states that it comes in tapped. You add a colorless to your mana pool, but you can tap and put a +1/+1 counter on target colorless creature that has entered the battlefield this turn. So it'll just be useful for pumping my guys a little tiny bit every time I get one. Next up, we have the Sanctum of Ugin. And it taps for a colorless, but when you cast a colorless creature spell with converted mana cost 7 or greater, you can sacrifice this to dig up a colorless creature and put it in your hand. So for casting big stuff, you get to find big stuff, which is really cool. Our next land in consideration is Winding Canyons, which taps for colorless, but you can pay 2 and tap it to give all your creature spells flash until end of turn. So Flash has always been powerful. It is one of the most powerful keywords in the game, allowing you to play creatures on one of your opponent's turns. Really good. Really good effect. Next land up for consideration is Homeward Path. It taps for a colorless, or you can tap it to make each player regain control of all their own creatures. That's a really good effect because I don't want people stealing my stuff. Then we have Mirror Pool. It enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for a colorless, but I can pay 2 and a colorless and tap it and sacrifice it to copy an instant or sorcery that I control. I get to choose new targets. Or I can pay 4 and a colorless and tap it and sack it to put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of target creature that I control. So I can double up on a particularly devastating Eldrazi if I want to. I can make another copy of something like a Steel Hellkite. And that is a very powerful effect. And that's on a land. So that's also going to be kind of tough to deal with. Next up we have Eldrazi Temple, which I'm pretty sure a lot of people do know. It taps to add a colorless, or you can tap it to add 2 colorless, but only spend it on Eldrazi spells, or activate Eldrazi abilities. Pretty good. It's extra ramp. Next up, we have Phyrexia's Core, which is you can tap it to add a colorless to your mana pool, but you can also pay 1 and sacrifice an artifact to gain a life, in case you're desperate in need of life gain. Next up, we have Darksteel Citadel. It's an indestructible artifact land that taps for a colorless. It's a pretty good land, actually. It survives board wipes, which is really... land wipes is what I should say. Land wipes are actually going to be a huge problem for this deck, so hopefully I can counter them with Kozilek, but if I can't, then I at least get to keep that one. Next up, we have Buried Ruin, which it taps for color. All my land's going to be tapping for colorless, guys, so I'm going to stop saying it's going to tap for colorless. Thinking about that real quick. But you can pay 2 and tap it and sack it to return an artifact from your grave to your hand. Again, useful ability. Next up, we have Strip Mine. It can tap to destroy a land for destroying troublesome lands. It has no restrictions, which makes that particularly devastating. Next up, we have Spawning Bed. The important text is pay 6 and tap it, and sack it to add 3 Eldrazi Scions to your battlefield, and they tap to add a colorless to your mana pool. So this can kind of give you pseudo ramp, but you lose a land to do so. So that's not necessarily great. Temple of the False Gods is up next. It can add 2 if you control 5 or more lands. So only useful later on. Next up, we have Reliquary Tower. It gives you no maximum hand size. Pretty good land. A lot of people run it in a lot of other decks. We have Rogue's Passage up next, which you can pay 4 and tap it to make a creature unblockable. Now, that land can be particularly deadly in this deck because your commander is a 12/12, and if you deal 21 points of commander damage, you will automatically make a person lose the game. So you only have to hit twice with Kozilek in order for someone to die, which is pretty good. That's a really powerful effect. So being able to make him unblockable, deadly. Extremely deadly. Next up, we have Haven of the Spirit Dragon. You can tap it for colorless, obviously, like all my land. You can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool if you want to cast a dragon spell. That's not important. The important text here is you can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice it to return target dragon creature card or Ugin Planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, the reason that's so good is we run Ugin Planeswalkers, and I'm going to show you some of the cards that are going to be making cuts and stuff like that. And I'm going to be making cuts on stream and all that stuff, but Ugin has always been powerful, and he just received a recent new iteration, and he is also powerful in that. So being able to get an Ugin back is really good for us. Next up, we have Drownyard Temple, which you can pay 3 and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. If it gets blown up, you just keep bringing it back. Pretty good. Next up, we have Mage Ring Network. You can pay 1 and tap it to put a charge counter on it, and then you can tap it and remove the charge counters to add that much colorless mana to your mana pool. So it's like one of those storage lands that you can, like Molten Slag Heap, which you can put storage counters on it and then add a combination of black and red to your mana pool. Except this one only works for colorless. It's a pretty good effect. Next up, we have Detention Tower, which removes hexproof from your opponents and their creatures. Or is it permanents? Give me just a second here. Your opponents and creatures your opponents control. Okay. So this gets rid of hexproof on your opponents and on their critters, which is really good because our removal is so expensive. We don't want to be able to not hit some of their stuff. Next up, we have Arcane Lighthouse, doubling up on the effect, except this one also hits Shroud. But I don't think it hits... Yeah, this one doesn't hit players. This one only hits their creatures. Next up, we have Radiant Fountain. It gives you 2 life when it comes into play. Pretty good. Next up, we actually have one of the new cards from War of the Spark that I pulled. We have Emergence Zone. And what it does is you can pay 1 and tap it and sack it to give all your spells flash. So it's like the Winding Canyons, except this does not limit it to what spells you can cast. However, it does limit it to a one-time effect, whereas the Winding Canyons can constantly give your creatures flash. Next up, we have Tomb of the Spirit Dragon, which you can pay 2 and tap it to add 1 life for each colorless creature you control. So that's also going to be a lot of life gain. Next card we have up is Seagate Wreckage, and you can pay 2 and a colorless and tap it to draw a card if you have no cards in hand. So I can see myself pitching a bunch of cards and accidentally running out of a hand, so that can actually help you draw a couple of extra cards. Always a useful ability. Drawing cards is one of the kings of Magic, in my opinion. And then we have the Ark of Orazca, which, if you have Ascend, you can pay 5 and tap it to draw a card, but only if you have the City's Blessing. And then this last little stack right here are all basic wastes. Wastes are the basic land for colorless. So I'll have to determine how many of those cards I'm actually going to be using and how many I'm going to be cutting. So this is going to be an interesting deck idea. But now we are going to go ahead and continue on with the real meat of the Kozilek deck. The cards that will be, hopefully, winning me the game. So I'm just going to set this down and show them off one at a time. And I will be actually building this deck on stream. So there will be cards that I will probably be cutting from this. Because I think if I remember right, I have to cut about 8 cards from this stack. So we're going to go ahead and be jumping right on into this. First card on my list is Ujin's Conjurant. It's a new card. It is a Spirit Monk. And when it comes into play, it has X as its mana cost. And when it comes into play, it comes in with that many +1/+1 counters on it. And if this card would be dealt damage, you prevent that damage and remove that many +1/+1 counters from it. So this card gets incrementally weaker as it takes damage, which could be a problem unless X is really high and you have a way to make it unblockable, like with that Rogue's Passage. So this card is kind of on the chopping block a little bit because there's a card that does almost the same thing minus the bottom clause. And it's actually our next card on the list, which is Endless One. The Endless One, you just pay X, and it comes in with X +1/+1 counters on it, minus that bottom clause. So I like this card because you can make it as big as you want, or you can play it early for an early blocker. And the deck has a lot of high drops in it because you are going to be ramping hard. That is your ultimate goal in the end, is to ramp hard enough to outrace people and get that Kozilek out to refill your hand. So refilling your hand is particularly important in this. So, next up we have Ever-Flowing Chalice. And it is a 0-drop, has a multi-kicker of 2, and when it enters the battlefield, it enters with a charge counter on it for each time it was kicked, and it adds a mana to your mana pool for each charge counter on it. Now, this card seems really bad, but it's not. This is easily one of your best ramp spells, because if you have 4 mana, you can put 2 charge counters on this. And when it gets 2 charge counters, you have 2 mana at your disposal. If it's later in the game and you want to decide, I need the biggest rock I can possibly get, and let's say you pump in Magical Christmas Time, 12 mana into this, and it doesn't get countered, then you can then you have a mana rock that taps for 6 mana, which is pretty outrageous. But let's be honest here, they're going to try to stop that from happening. But it's good early, it's good late. That's the huge draw to that card, and I think that's going to be one of the better cards in the deck. Next up, we have Soul Ring, auto-include, taps for 2 colorless, taps for my colors. 1-drop, taps for 2. Easily one of the best cards in Commander. Next, we have a Mana Vault. Pay 1, adds 3, deals damage to me if I can't pay 4 on my upkeep. That card can do some crazy stuff. Early, it'll help you get up to Kozilek. Later, it helps stabilize after a artifact board wipe. So, I think that card is pretty darn good, and it will be in the deck. Next, we have Expedition Map. What this card does is you pay 2 and second to dig up any land out of your deck and put it in your hand. You do have to reveal it. So if you are going for the Tron strats, which I showed you, the Urza Tower, the Urza's Power Plant, and the Urza's Mine, if you choose to go for those with the Expedition Map, people will know. If you already have 2 on the field and have not played your land and dig up the 3rd one, they're in trouble, because there's very few instances of instant speed board wipe. So, that card can be extremely good, or it can dig up a utility land, whatever you need it to do. So, Expedition Map is pretty good. Next, we have Swiftfoot Boots. It is an equipment that you pay that costs 2, and you have to equip it with 1. It gives the equipped creature haste and hexproof. Haste is probably the strongest keyword in the game. It allows you to ignore summoning sickness, and it allows you to do some really, really dumb stuff. Like having that out and then dropping Kozilek and equipping that to him. That is almost a game ender if people are not expecting it. So, and then they also can't target him. Your opponents won't be able to target him because he's hexproof. And then you can just sit there and counter stuff and smack him with a 12-12. Pretty good. Pretty good ability. Next up, we have another equipment. Its cousin, Lightning Greaves. It does the same thing, except it has an equip 0, and instead of giving hexproof, it gives Shroud. So that means not even you can target it. So if you happen to have only Kozilek on the field, and someone takes control of your turn somehow with, like, say, an Emrakul or a Mindslaver, they would have to have a target to unequip those boots onto. And because of equipment's Oracle text, it states that it can only be things that you control. So, that's a pretty good effect. Next card we have in our list is Mind Stone. It is covering one of the weak bases of the deck, which is card draw. It's a mono rock that taps for 1, or you can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it to draw a card. This card is particularly useful because, like I said, Kozilek's deck actually has problems drawing cards, which you wouldn't think so with the commander being Kozilek. But are we going to be able to reliably get to 10 every time? I don't think that's going to be the case every time. We might struggle, and we'll need the extra card draw. So it's covering a base that is very important. Next up, we have a ramp spell, Thematic Compass. Yes, Thematic Compass. Sorry about that. It costs 2, and you can tap. You can pay 3 and tap it to search for a basic land, reveal it, and put it in your hand. And at the beginning of your end step, if you control 7 or more lands, you get to transform this into the Spires of Orazca. And what the Spires do is they tap for colorless, but it turns it into a Maze of Ith. You're able to remove a creature an opponent controls from combat, and it turns into a land. So it suits your ramping needs in 2 different ways. And it gets you cards back in hand, which that's not really super important, but that Pact of Negation could come in clutch if you have that extra land. Next up, we have Worn Power Stone. It enters the play tapped for 3, but it taps for 2 colorless. Basic mono rock. And this deck needs to have a lot of ramp because we play a lot of big stuff, and we have to be the scary player. Next up, we have Unstable Obelisk. It is a rock that taps for 1, but you have to pay 3 for it. Its important text is actually the pay 7 and tap it and sacrifice it to destroy target permanent. Removal is one of the other big issues with the Kozilek deck. So having a mono rock that you can later turn into a removal spell is pretty good. Removal is one of the biggest weaknesses of this deck. And there's a card that I should have included in this deck that I didn't, and it might go in there, which is the Spine of Ish-Sha. But I'll cover that later when I get to its converted monocost area, because this is actually in converted monocost order. Next, we have Burnished Heart, the famous elk. You can pay 3 and sack it to dig up 2 basic lands, and put them into your hand. And it is a 2/2 for 3. This is important because you can you can take cards out of your deck. It allows you to manipulate what you're drawing a little bit, and it's a powerful card, and it should probably be run in almost every single commander deck. But that's okay. I don't run it in a lot of mine because I only have a handful of copies of it. Next, we have Palladium Mirror. It is a 3-drop for a 2/2 that taps for 2 colorless. It's ramp. That's its purpose. It's not there to, it can be there to block if you absolutely need a blocker. But it's mostly there to be a mono dork. Next in our list is Pilgrim's Eye. Does the same thing as the Thematic Compass. Digs up basics. Puts them in hand. But this is also on a flyer, which the deck is weak to flyers because I don't have a lot of them. So Pilgrim's Eye covers 2 bases. Good flying blocker and ramp. Next, we have Basalt Monolith. You pay 3 for a mono rock that produces 3 mana, and then you pay 3 to untap it. Powerful ability, and a very powerful mono rock. There are degenerate combos with it, but you kind of need to be in colors for that. Although there is the Rings of Brighthearth combo with it, which can produce infinite mana, but I'm not running that. I don't own that. I don't own the rings, so I can't run it. Ooh, this card is super spicy. Next up, we have Mirage Mirror. It is a 3-drop that you can pay 2 to turn it into a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until end of turn. This literally covers anything you need it to be. If you need this card to be a creature that your opponent has, you can do it. If you need it to be a land for a turn, which is probably one of its weakest functions, unless it turns into Cabal coffers that your opponents control, which is pretty spicy, it can do it. It's honestly one of the best cards in the deck, and there is no way it's going to get cut. It can be an artifact ramp card for all I need it to be, or it can turn into a giant Eldrazi. It's that powerful and that versatile. Next up, we have the card Titan's Presence. And this costs 3 to cast at instant speed. Ooh, colorless instants. Those are pretty rare. But as an additional cost to cast it, you have to reveal a colorless creature card from your hand. But you exile a creature whose power is less than the power of the creature you revealed. So, let's say it's Magical Christmas Land. You reveal an Artisan of Kozilek. Its power is 11. You can exile any creature on the field whose power is less than 11 or equal to 11. Yes, less than or equal to. So, that's a very powerful card, and it's really good removal. Next up, we have a board wipe. We have Oblivion Stone. It costs 3 to cast, but you can pay 4 and tap it to put a fate counter on a card, on any permanent. And then you can pay 5 and tap this and sacrifice it to destroy each non-land permanent without a fate counter. But then you remove all the fate counters. Like I said, the deck struggles with removal, but there's a lot of artifacts that can board wipe. So we're going to be running a lot of board wipes in the deck because we have a few tricks up our sleeve for if we accidentally have to wipe our boards and get rid of all our mono rocks and stuff like that. Ooh, next up's a kind of a cool card. It's a slow card draw spell, kinda, which is Oracle's Vault. You can pay, it costs 4, and you pay 2 and tap it to exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card, and you put a brick counter on this card. Its bottom text is, tap it and exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost. Activate this only if you have 3 brick counters on it. So, the Oracle's Vault allows you to use the cards off the top of your deck as free spells, potentially, if you have enough brick counters on it. The other important clause on that is it says you can play them. So if you hit a land with that, you can still play it. It's not just going to whiff on your lands, which is really nice. Okay, so the next card we have in our list is another board wipe on an artifact. We have the Perilous Vault. It costs 4 to cast and 5 and a tap to use, and you exile it, but you exile all non-land permanents. This particular card is going to be a little bit more strict on when I have to use it, just because I don't want to exile all my stuff. It's probably going to get exiled by my opponents, but they're not going to be able to exile it as much as that would. And I don't want to lose all my mono rocks to exile, because I have ways of recurring them. I'm pretty sure if most of you know where Eldrazi decks go, you know the 2 cards I'm talking about. Next up, we have the Unwinding Clock. It untaps all artifacts during my opponent's untap steps. Very powerful card. This card can win you games, or it can provide you very needed defense, because we have to play defense. We're going to be playing big stuff, and some of it's going to have to be artifacts, because there's not enough colorless stuff to just go around. Oh, that Unwinding Clock would be great for untapping a Solemn Simulacrum. When it enters, it gets you a land. When it dies, it gets you a card. This covers 2 bases that the deck is weak in. That's why it's going in. Next up, we have the Quicksilver Amulet. It's kind of an odd card, and I kind of count it as ramp. It costs 4, and then you have to pay 4 and tap it, but you get to put any creature from your hand onto the battlefield. The only issue with this card is I have a lot of cards that require a casting trigger, and this bypasses the casting trigger. So it'll be useful, but not for those cards. Next up, we have Thran Dynamo. Costs 4 to cast and taps to add 3 colorless. One of the best cards in the deck. Next, we have the Hedron Archives. It costs 4 to cast, taps to add 2 colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. It's a slightly beefier Mind Stone. And Mind Stone is pretty important because it provides ramp and card draw. And so is Hedron Archive. Next, we have Nevinyrral's Disc. This costs 4 to cast, enters the battlefield tapped, but I can pay 1 and tap it to destroy all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. This also destroys itself, though, because it is an artifact. This card has a lot of hatred around it, and it poses an interesting problem, because most of the time people have an entire turn of staring at it to be like, okay, I can't play my biggest threats because he'll just blow them up, but I need to do something about that disc. Either they have to blow it up themselves, or they have to kill me. And a lot of times they'll just play a couple of small threats and just start hitting me. That's the risk of playing Nev's Disc, but it's a very good card. And you can kind of hold it over people's heads. Next card we have, entering our 5-drops now, is Tamiyo's Journal. At the beginning of each of your upkeeps, you get to investigate, which puts a clue on the field. Clues are pretty important because you get to draw cards off of clue, and the deck lacks card draw. However, another important text here is tap and sacrifice 3 clues to tutor for any card and put it in your hand. Then you shuffle your library. So this deck literally doesn't tutor for anything. You can search for some stuff, but they're mostly just colorless creatures. This lets you get any card out of your deck if you have 3 clues. It is very slow card draw, or a very, very slow tutor, because it has to last 3 turns in order for you to tutor for 1 card. I have a feeling that card's going to get blown up almost every time I play it. Next card we have is Mind's Eye. Whenever an opponent draws a card, I can pay 1. If I do, draw a card. This can draw me a substantial amount of cards, which is why it's going in the deck. Tutoring is going to be less important than card draw, just sheer card draw in this deck. Ooh, this card draws so much hatred from the tables. We have Paradox Engine. Paradox Engine states whenever you cast a spell, untap all non-land permanents you control. So, let's say this is Magical Christmas Land. I have Monovault, Thran Dynamo, and Soul Ring, and one other. What's the other ramp spell? I think it was. I don't know if I said Basalt Monolith, but I have 3 cards that tap for 3 mana. But let's just say I have those 4 cards, the 3 that tap for 3 in the Soul Ring. I can just basically play my entire hand that turn, because I can just get to keep untapping everything. So I can cast a Kozilek. I can cast my commander out of it. I can cast the other Kozilek. I can cast Artisan of Kozilek. Oh man, there's so many Kozilek cards in this deck. But yes, that card is crazy. And if I can somehow do stuff on my opponent's turns, then I can also somehow get blockers up, which is pretty nifty. Next up, we have a Kozilek card, Kozilek's Channeler. What it does is it taps for 2 mana, and it's a 4/4. It is a beefy ramp spell with a big old body. That's pretty important, because even if I don't need the mana anymore, then I have a 4/4 that I can hit with, and 4 is not an unsubstantial number. Next up, we have Blinkmoth Urn. At the beginning of each player's upkeeps, or pre-combat main phase, if this is untapped, each player gets to add a colorless to their mana pool equal to the amount of artifacts they control. So, considering my deck is colorless, I'm likely going to have the most artifacts in play, unless someone literally builds an artifact deck, which there's a few people in my play group that have a few of them, but Blinkmoth Urn is mostly going to be giving me what I need more than anyone else, and that is what is important here. Next up, we have Gilded Lotus. Although it produces colored mana, it produces 3 of it. So, the only thing you can't choose as colorless is a color, because it's not a color. It's colorless. So, Gilded Lotus can never be used to cast your commander. but it can be used to reduce the generic mana. But in terms of the colorless, it can't get rid of that colorless. Next up, we have Blight Herder. When you cast this, you can return 2 cards in your opponent's own from exile to their graveyards. If you do, create 3 1/1 Scions that tap for mana. This kind of counts as a ramp spell because a lot of my removal is going to be exiling their stuff. And then this, although it gives 2 cards back, it doesn't specify which graveyards that you have to exile from. So, you could return 1 card from one person's graveyard and another card from another person's graveyard and get the 3 Scions. That's a really good effect. Next up, we have the Orbs of Warding. It gives you hexproof, and if a creature would deal damage to you, you could prevent 1 of it. That doesn't seem like a lot, but the big thing about that is there's a lot of tokens that card just outright shuts down. Tokens are pretty important in my group because someone runs a token deck, and not being able to take damage from those tokens is really important. Next, we have the Geode Golem. Now, this guy is pretty nifty. He is a 5/3 for 5, and he has Trample. And he states that if you deal combat damage to a player, you may cast your commander from the command zone without paying its mana cost. You still have to pay any additional costs. So, if I have him out on turn 2 and hit someone with him on turn 3, I get to cast Kozilek out of my command zone. And this is not just put him onto the field. This is cast. So I also get to refill my hand off of him so that I have a full grip ready to counter spells. Next up, we have our first 6-drop, which is Oblivion Sower. And what he does is when you cast him, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of his or her library. Then you put any number of lands they exiled onto the battlefield under your control. So he counts as ramp, and he has a big body. He is a 5/8. So he's a ramp spell, and he's a big body. 2 very important factors for the deck. Next, we have the Dreamstone Hedron. It's like the Mind Stone. It costs 6, it taps to add 3 colorless to your pool, and you can pay 3 and tap it to draw 3 cards. So, Mind Stone and Hedron Archive. Now we have another one that's even better. Next, we have a very juicy card that outright wins games. We have Planar Bridge. It costs 6 to cast, but it has an activated ability of pay 8 and tap it. And you get to search for any permanent card and put it onto the battlefield. So, this is a tutor for any permanent in your deck, and you get to put it right into play. It doesn't cast, so if you do grab something that requires a casting trigger, it ignores that. However, you get any permanent out of your deck, and if that card's not dealt with, you win. Period. Outright. Next card's a card a lot of people hate. Wormcoil Engine. It's a 6/6 for 6, and it has Death Touch and Lifelink, and when it dies, it produces 2 3/3 worms, one that has Death Touch and one that has Lifelink. A lot of people fear this card. It gains you a substantial amount of life on every hit, and when you kill it, you get 2 tokens. One that has Death Touch and one that has Lifelink. That's a pretty good trade-off, to be honest. Even if it dies and you lose your 6/6, you still keep your 6 power and 6 toughness worth of creatures. It just splits the Death Touch and Lifelink triggers up. That's all it does. Very powerful card, and a lot of people love that card, but they also hate seeing it. Next on our list, we have Endbringer. Now, this card is actually pretty interesting. It is a 5/5 for 6, and it untaps during each other player's untap step. That's a pretty good effect. It counts as a pinger, You can tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. You can pay a colorless and tap it to make it so that target creature can't attack or block this turn. That effect's generally not going to be used, from my understanding, but it does have uses. Or you can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card. The deck struggles with card draw, so drawing a card is pretty important, and being able to do that every turn, pretty good. Next, we have Staff of Nin. Cost 6. At your upkeep, you draw an extra card. That's basically what it's there for, but you can also tap it to deal 1 damage to target creature or player. I think that text got errated to change it to any target, so you can also hit planeswalkers with it. This card is so good, and people blow it up every time they see it. It is Steel Hellkite. It is a 6-drop for a 5/5. You can pay 2 to give it fire breathing. But the important text here is the X. Destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost X, whose controller was dealt combat damage by Steel Hellkite this turn. Activate this ability only once each turn. So if you hit someone with this and pay, let's say 3, you destroy all their 3 drops. Or you pay 5, destroy all their 5 drops. Or pay 2 and destroy all their 2 drops, and etc., etc. Once each turn. Just once, though. Next up in our list, we have Contagion Engine. What it does is it costs 6, and when it enters, you choose an opponent and put -1/-1 counters on each creature they have. Then you can pay 4 and tap this and proliferate, then proliferate again. This card is kind of on the block for me, the chopping block, because this card, although proliferating is very good, there's only been 3 cards in the entire deck that deal with counters so far. 4 if you count this one. And they were the first 3. They were my 2 X spells and Everflowing Chalice. So, although that effect is very powerful, I don't know if that's the right card for this deck. But we're going to see if I can find anything else that produces +1/+1 counters. Actually, that one land does that too. So that actually could be pretty powerful. Next up, we have another new card from War of the Spark. God Pharaoh's Statue. It costs 6, and it's a legendary artifact. Spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more to cast. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses a life. We have a lot of people who think that losing a life every turn is really annoying in our group. So they will likely target that, but they have to spend 2 additional mana to kill it. That card is so good. But I don't know if I'm going to be running it, because I don't know if I want to draw that much hatred to myself. Because I'm already going to be running a bunch of stuff that people are not going to like. So that card might get cut out, but it can slow them down if I can get it fast. Next card in our list is Thopter Assembly. It is a 6-drop for a 5/5 flyer, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control no Thopters other than this one, you return this to your hand and put 5 1/1 Thopters on the field. They're all colorless, and they all fly. This card is kind of in there to help me deal with flyers, because it's like I said, my deck does not have a lot of those, and I have to deal with a lot of flyers in my group. So being able to just chump block flyers is pretty important for me. And having a card that keeps producing them, that's just icing on the cake. Next, we have Conduit of Ruin. So, this card is pretty interesting. And it says, when you cast it, you get to search for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater, reveal it, shuffle your library, and put it on top. So it's ensuring that you get at least a 7-drop on your next turn. And then it says the first creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 less to cast. So you can make your giant card that you just grabbed on, that you just drew off the top of your deck, cheaper. That's a really powerful effect, and I kind of count it in the ramp category. But it also counts as card selection, is where I'd put that one, not card draw. Next, we have Lore Seeker's Stone. It costs 6 to cast, but you can pay 3 and tap it to draw 3 cards. This ability, though, costs 1 more for each card in your hand. So the more cards you have, the more substantial that's going to cost to activate just to draw 3 cards. This is better when you're behind. If you are far in the lead on card advantage, this is a terrible card for you, because it will cost so much to activate that card. And I don't really like cards with that kind of stipulation on them. Next up, we have another new War of the Spark card, and it's a card that I mentioned earlier with one of my lands being able to bring it back, which is Ugin the Ineffable. So what he does is he costs 6, and he makes your colorless spells cost 2 less to cast. So he's ramp. He starts at 4 loyalty, and his +1 is you exile the top card of your library face down. You create a 2/2 spirit creature token, and when it leaves play, you return the exiled card to your hand. So he's also card draw, and he creates creatures. So swing in, start dealing damage, and if they kill the creature, fine. If they exile it, fine. You get the card back. -3, destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So he's also removal. Ugin the Ineffable is literally everything this deck wants it to be. It is removal, it is ramp, and it is card draw. And it makes creatures. That is one of the strongest cards in this deck. And I cannot see myself cutting that card for anything. Next, we have the Bane of Bala Ged. It costs 7, and it's a 7/5. And when it attacks, defending player exiles 2 permanents he or she controls. Now, this card reminds me a lot of Annihilator, except it's got the exile clause on it instead, so it's not truly Annihilator. However, I'm not a huge fan of its size. It's a 7-drop, and it's a 7/5. But that 5 is really impactful on it. People are going to just chump block this to no end, and it'll likely die from being chumped too many times. Because eventually their stuff's just going to outgrow it. And they're going to be playing things with 5 power and 6 power, and it'll just get outclassed. So although it does have the pseudo Annihilator trigger on it, I feel like that card's kind of not great. Unlike the next card I just picked up off the top, which is a Chroma's Memorial. This card gives all your creatures flying, first strike, vigilance, trample, haste, and protection from black and red. So what does all that mean? It gives your creatures flying so they can only be blocked by creatures with flying or reach. It gives first strike so that they deal their damage first. It gives vigilance so that in combat they don't have to tap to attack, so they are free to block on their next turn. They give trample, so if they have anything that's if they block with stuff, like if they choose to chump block it with 1/1s and they block your 10/10, 9 damage goes through, because you have to deal enough to kill the blocker, and then the rest of that goes through to their health. Trample is also a very powerful keyword, but next up is haste, which I've already described as probably the best keyword. And then we have protection from black and red. And what that basically means is that anything that's black or red cannot target it. So spells that are black and red can't target that. It can't be dealt damage by anything that's black or red. So in combat, if they block, actually they won't even be able to block with those, but if you choose to block something that's black or red, it just doesn't deal damage to your creatures. Black and red creatures can't block something with protection from their black or red, so your stuff is essentially unblockable to things that are black and red. That's pretty good. That card is so strong. Next up, we have an Eldrazi spell, All is Dust. It is a tribal sorcery, and it says each player sacrifices all colored permanents he or she controls. This card is one of the strongest in the deck. It costs 7 for a board wipe, but it hits nothing of mine. I have no colored permanents in the deck because the deck's colorless. It's a one-sided board wipe. That's strong. Next, we have an annoying card, Platinum Angel. Costs 7 for a 4/4 flyer, and it states that you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. That's literally ridiculous card text. That is one of the most nutty card texts that you'll ever see. And if you play it and they don't take care of it, you can drop to negative 500 health and it's going to do nothing to you. And then they can't win. So if one of them would be left alive and standing and I have that out, they just can't win until they get rid of it. Very good effect. Next, we have Mirror Battlesphere. It's there to create chump blockers when it enters the battlefield. It's a 4/7 for 7, and it creates 4/1/1 mirror. But when this attacks, you may also tap X untap mirrors you control to give this +X+O until end of turn, and it deals that much damage to defending player. So it's mostly there to produce bodies to block. However, it also has the ability to deal some direct damage, and it can be an 8/7 off of just the 4 mirror it produces alone. Next, we have Meteor Golem. When it enters the battlefield, it destroys a non-land permanent an opponent controls. So it's a removal on a creature. It is a 7-drop for a 3/3, but being able to destroy any permanent, any non-land permanent, is pretty powerful. Next, we have Scour from Existence, another colorless instant, and it says exile target permanent for 7. My removal is going to be really expensive, and since we're in the subject of removal, the card I forgot to put in here was Spine of Ishsaw, which states when it enters the battlefield, it destroys target permanent, and when it goes to the graveyard, I think you put it back in your hand. So that Phyrexian Core, you could just keep sacking the Spine of Ishsaw and take care of and do a really slow, repeatable removal spell. It's really slow, but it's also an artifact, so it's pretty good. Next up, we have another Planeswalker, Karn Liberated. You pay 7 for him. He starts at 6. His +4 is target player exiles a card from his or her hand. So now we have discard going on to give you better card advantage. -3, exile target permanent. Removal. Pretty good. -14 is restart the game, but no one's going to restart the game. But you leave all the cards that are exiled with Karn Liberated in exile, and then you put those cards onto the battlefield, except for auras and instants and sorceries, because those aren't permanent. Because the instants and sorceries aren't permanents, but auras would have no targets for them, so they would just go away. Overall, Karn is very powerful, and I love playing a Karn. Next up, we have an enchantment. A colorless enchantment known as Eldrazi Conscription. You pay 8 to enchant a creature. You give the creature +10/+10, trample, and Annihilator 2. Annihilator says that when the defending player has to sacrifice however much the Annihilator is for when they're attacked by that creature. And they have to sack that many permanents. So Eldrazi Conscriptions is really powerful because it gives a creature +10/+10. And we should be able to cast it reliably. Next, we have Ugin, the Spirit Dragon. The original Ugin. Very powerful card. He costs 8, and he starts at 7. +2, he deals 3 damage to any target, so he lightning bolts. -X, this is kind of the important ability. Exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less. That's 1 or more colors. He is a board wipe for colored permanents. And then his -10 is you gain 7 life, draw 7 cards, then put up to 7 permanents from your hand onto the battlefield. Most of my deck is already permanents, so that's essentially draw 7, get 7 free things. That's pretty good. Next up, we have our 9 drops, which I forgot to mention. Those were the 8 drops. In the 9 drop category, we are starting with Void Winnower. So he is an 11-9 for 9, and he basically says your opponents can't even. That's the joke in our group. But his true text is your opponents can't cast spells with even converted mana costs, with 7 also being even, or not 7, 0 being even. And your opponents can't block with creatures with even converted mana costs. So this is actually a pretty important card for the deck because it can kind of screw up blockers. Because if it has an even converted mana cost, they're not going to be able to block with it. That's really huge. That card is also a pain to deal with because a lot of removal is actually even in converted mana cost. So, next card in our list is Artisan of Kozilek. When you cast him, you get to return a creature from your grave to the battlefield, and he's got Annihilator 2, and he's a 10-9. He's a big, scary dude. And he recurs a creature. Next up, we have the original Kozilek, the Butcher of Truth. He's a 10-drop for a 12-12. When you cast him, you get 4 cards. He has Annihilator 4, and he states when he's put into the graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into their library, which includes Kozilek. So this is the original Kozilek, and that's the trick that we use here. Is the return your graveyard to your deck. He is literally entire graveyard recursion back to your deck, so you can reuse your stuff. Next up, we have Ulamog. The Ceaseless Hunger. For 10, you get a 10-10. When he's cast, you exile 2 permanents. Also, the draw 4 trigger is also on cast, so even if they counter it, you get 4 cards. This, you get to exile 2 permanents if you cast it, which is ridiculous. And he's indestructible, and when he attacks, the defending player puts the top 20 cards into exile. That starts destroying decks so quickly. And it can just literally ruin someone's day. Next up, we have Desolation Twin. And what this card does is it's a 10-drop for a 10-10. And when you cast it, you put a 10-10 colorless Eldrazi creature token onto the battlefield. So he comes in with a 10-10 buddy every time you cast him. That's really good. 20 power for 10 mana. That's ridiculous. Next, we have the original Ulamog, the Infinite Gyre. When you cast him, you destroy target permanent. He's got Annihilator 4 and Indestructible, and he's got the Graveyard Clause as well that Kozilek, the Butcher of Truth, had. So, neat little graveyard tricks. Next, we have Darksteel Colossus. He costs 11 for an 11-11 with Trample. He's indestructible, and when he's put into the graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle him back into your deck. Now, a lot of people are probably wondering, when I get to 12 drops, are you running the Blightsteel? And the answer is no. I'm not running Blightsteel. The big reason I don't like Blightsteel is I don't like inflicting infect damage. I don't like poison as a mechanic. I'm not saying that poison is weak. I'm saying that poison is cheap. You only need 10 poison to kill someone, and Darksteel or Blightsteel Colossus is either an 11-11 or a 12-12. I think he's an 11-11. So he can literally just one-shot someone. And I don't think that kind of power is needed in Commander. Especially since it's supposed to be a fun format. Although 90% of the time, when you see Blightsteel pop up, he just immediately dies. So, that's a thing that happens. Now, this card is pretty important. It is It That Betrays. And what he does is he is an 11-11 for 12. He's got Annihilator 2, and when an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, you put that onto the battlefield under your control. So there's an important ruling with that particular card, and that rule is, what happens if my opponent sacrifices their commander? Does it have to go to the graveyard? What happens if it goes to exile? And blah, 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 blah. The important thing about that is it does not specify where the card has to go on that. So if they annihilate their commander into the command zone, you're like, cool story, bro. I get that, because it only cares about the sacrifice trigger. It doesn't matter where it goes. There's only one time it does, and that's if it hits the graveyard and then they exile it. And then let's say someone exiles their graveyard. That prevents them from getting it. That's the only instance where that actually cares. But that was also the last card of our set. So now I have to go on to explain what the deck's trying to do and cut some cards from this. I have to cut about 8 cards. So, what Kozilek is aiming to do. You play big things, you counter some spells with Kozilek, and you draw some cards. It's a pretty simple strategy, but it works. And also, Kozilek can deal enough commander damage that it makes it really easy for him to win with it. So, I think that's easily the mission statement for the deck, is just get big creatures out and beat some face in. So, now I need to look through this stack of cards and cut about 8 cards, I think. Because I have about 8 too many. So I'm going to take a quick peek here and find some of the ones that I thought were kind of weak and pull them out. Okay, here's one. It is the Bane of Bala Ged. Like I said, it has the Pseudo Annihilator trigger, but I am not a huge fan of this card, because having only Annihilator on a small-ish body is not the best idea. So I think I'm going to go ahead and cut that card. Next one on our list is the Lore Seeker Stone. Like I said, I don't like having conditional card draw. I want to be able to draw my cards and be done with it. I don't want to have to meet conditions to draw my cards. So as cool as this card is, I think it's not good enough for the deck. Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and say that maybe Contagion Engine might not be the best solution for this deck. Putting a -1/-1 on everything is cool and all, but it's going to take you a long time to get rid of some of those big things. Like, if they have a bunch of 6-drops, it's going to take you 3 turns to get rid of that, and they're going to see you doing that. After turn 1, after turn you played this, they're going to figure out really quick that they made a mistake in letting you cast this. So, as good as that card is, I don't think it makes the cut. Let's see here. What else is in this deck? Okay. So I think I found our next card. I think it's actually going to be Ugin's Conjurant. Because Endless One is really good because it doesn't have that bottom clause. The fact that this has a bottom clause of every time it's dealt damage, you remove that many +1/+1 counters from it, that's just bad. That's a really bad effect to have on a card. Okay, so I need to look through this again, looking a little more widely at stuff. And I think I found our next card. I'm not a huge fan of making my opponents pay more outright. I like the idea of propaganda and ghostly prison because they're kind of fair about it. This just requires them to pay more to cast stuff, and that feels wrong, especially when I'm running a colorless deck and I have to try to convince some of the people to be my allies. Let's see here. We've gotten 5 cards out of the deck. I need about 3 or 4 more. Yeah, 5 cards are out of the deck. Oh, let's see here. This is actually a pretty tough choice, if I do say so myself. Okay, so I think I found my next card to come out. I think it's actually going to be the Staff of Nin, because it's a 6-drop artifact that's going to be drawing me an extra card every turn. It's a super expensive Howling Mine for me, and that's not the best ability on the planet. So I'm going to do a quick count real quick, because I want about 40 land in the deck, because I'm going to be running a really high curve. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, and 61. So I need to cut 2 cards. 2 more cards. That's all I need to cut. Okay, so I need to look through again just to make sure. And also, it's kind of hard to cut removal because I don't have a lot of removal. Now, let's see here. Okay. This is actually kind of tough now. I think one of my next cards that I'm going to cut is the Swiftfoot Boots. The reason I'm cutting this particular pair of boots is because although Hexproof is a better keyword for the deck so that I can target him, I don't have a lot of targeted buff effects or anything like that. So me targeting is not important, and having to pay 1 for these boots is really actually devastating to the deck. So now I have to cut 1 more card. And this is actually going to be quite rough. Okay, so I think the card I'm going to go ahead and cut. No, I really like that card. I really like Endbringer. This is what always happens, is I always get down to about 1 card, and then, oh, I like it too much. Okay. This is actually a really tough choice, guys. So bear with me as I grit my teeth and get on to it for just another moment longer. And then I'll explain why I'm cutting a card. Okay, so I actually think I am going to cut that card that I was thinking of cutting. And the card I cut is Endbringer. Because although Endbringer does have a lot of modes and it's very useful, its modes are kind of very narrow on their uses. You're mostly going to be using it to draw cards. That's how I primarily saw it, was as a card draw spell. And having to recur it every turn is not the best plan. So, we have reached the number of cards that I needed for this deck, which is 59 plus the commander, which is 60. They're all 60 cards for Kozilek, the Great Distortion. So, I gave you the general idea of what the deck's about, what it's going to be doing, and how it's going to be winning. The only thing I have left to do is see which of these lands I don't want, but I'm not going to do that on camera, because trimming land is not going to be fun to watch, because there's just so little fun in it. But anyways, I would like to go ahead and thank everyone who showed up to watch this, to see what my ideas were for this deck, and just having a great old time with you guys. So I really appreciate your support, and I hope you guys continue to keep coming back to see my Magic content or my streaming content, and just have a great time with it. That's really what my goal is here, is to let you guys have a great time and enjoy a place where you can feel wanted and talk to whoever you want to in the chat, and talk to me if you want to. But I'd like to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next stream. You guys have a great night.